The sun hung low over the endless prairie, casting long shadows across the dusty trail that stretched toward the horizon. Thomas McCarthy wiped the sweat from his weathered brow, his calloused hands gripping the reins of his tired horse, Belle. The medicine bottles in his saddlebags clinked softly with each step, a constant reminder of the precious cargo he carried and the urgency that drove him forward. Thomas had been riding for 3 days straight, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest his horse and take small sips of water from his dwindling canteen. The medicine he carried wasn't for him, though he desperately needed it. His lungs burned with each breath, a persistent cough racking his chest as the tuberculosis that had been slowly killing him for months grew worse with each passing day. The bottles contained the last hope for his younger brother Samuel, who lay dying in the town of Cedar Ridge, 2 days' ride ahead. The cowboy's face was gaunt, his once broad shoulders now hunched with exhaustion and illness. His blue eyes, though dimmed by fatigue, still held the determination that had carried him through countless cattle drives and harsh winters on the range. He had promised Samuel he would return with the medicine, and Thomas McCarthy had never broken a promise in his 43 years of life. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub, oak, and mesquite. Thomas knew he was entering territory that belonged to the Kiowa tribe, land that most white men avoided out of fear or prejudice. But Thomas had always been different. During his years working cattle in this region, he had encountered the native people several times, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he had always treated them with respect and dignity. The medicine had cost him everything he owned. He had sold his small ranch, his cattle, even his father's pocket watch to afford the expensive treatment that the doctor in Kansas City had prescribed. The physician had been clear about the dosage and timing. Samuel needed to begin the treatment immediately, or he would not survive another week. Thomas had calculated every mile, every hour of his journey, knowing that time was running out for his younger brother. As Belle's hooves clopped rhythmically on the hard-packed earth, Thomas found himself thinking about Samuel. Snow in October wasn't unheard of in this part of the country, and Thomas couldn't afford any delays. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices carried on the wind. Thomas reined in Belle and listened carefully. The voices were speaking in a language he didn't understand, but he recognized it as belonging to the native people of this region. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, not out of aggression, but from the caution that any wise traveler exercised in unfamiliar territory. As he topped a small rise, Thomas saw them. A group of about a dozen Kiowa warriors were gathered around something in a small valley below. Their horses stood nearby, and Thomas could see that several of the men appeared to be wounded. One warrior lay motionless on the ground while others knelt beside him, their voices urgent and concerned. Thomas sat on his horse for a long moment, watching the scene unfold below him. He could easily ride around the valley, avoid the group entirely, and continue on his way to Cedar Ridge. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he watched, he could see that the injured warrior was in serious condition, and the others seemed to be at a loss for how to help him. The cowboy's conscience warred with his practical need to reach his brother in time. He thought about the medicine in his saddlebags, the precious bottles that represented Samuel's only chance at survival. He thought about the promise he had made, the urgency of his mission, the miles still ahead of him. But he also thought about his father, who had taught him that a man's character was defined not by what he did when it was easy, but by what he did when it was hard. Thomas urged Belle forward, slowly descending the hill toward the group of Kiowa warriors. As he approached, the men turned toward him, their hands moving to their weapons. Thomas raised his hands in a gesture of peace, speaking in the few words of Kiowa he had learned over the years. "Friend," he called out in their language, hoping his pronunciation was clear enough to understand. "I come in peace." The warriors exchanged glances, clearly surprised to hear their language spoken by a white man. One of them, an older man with gray streaking his long black hair, stepped forward. He spoke in broken English, his voice cautious but not hostile. "You are alone, white man. Why do you come here?" Thomas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I saw you from the hill. Someone is hurt. I know some medicine." The older warrior studied Thomas for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in the cowboy's weathered appearance, his obvious illness, and the genuine concern in his expression. After what seemed like an eternity, the man nodded toward the injured warrior on the ground. "My son, Horse fell. He does not wake. Thomas approached carefully, the other warriors watching his every move. When he knelt beside the injured man, he could see immediately that the situation was serious. The young warrior, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, had obviously suffered a severe head injury. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and there was blood seeping from a wound on his scalp. But it was the way the young man's chest rose and fell in labored gasps that caused Thomas's heart to sink. He recognized the sound immediately. It was the same rattling breath that he had been hearing from his own lungs for months, and that Samuel had been fighting for weeks. This young warrior wasn't just injured from a fall. He was seriously ill with what Thomas suspected was the same tuberculosis that was killing both him and his brother. Thomas looked up at the older warrior, understanding now why the group seemed so helpless. They were dealing not just with an injury, but with a disease that was beyond their traditional healing methods. The cowboy felt the weight of the medicine bottles in his saddlebags like a physical burden. "He is very sick," Thomas said quietly, "not just from a fall. In his chest, his breathing." The older man's face grew grave. "Yes, the coughing sickness. It has taken others in our tribe. The medicine men cannot stop it." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of the impossible choice before him. In his saddlebags was the medicine that could save this young man's life, just as it could save Samuel's. But there was only enough for one person, and every moment he delayed here was a moment longer that Samuel waited for his return. The cowboy thought about his brother, probably lying in his bed in Cedar Ridge at that very moment, growing weaker with each hour that passed. He thought about Sarah, Samuel's wife, keeping vigil by his bedside, watching hopefully out the window for any sign of Thomas's return. He thought about the promise he had made, the sacrifice he had already made to obtain the medicine, the trust that Samuel had placed in him. But as he looked down at the young Kiowa warrior, barely more than a boy really, Thomas also thought about the father kneeling beside him, the same desperate hope in his eyes that Thomas had seen in Sarah's face. He thought about his own father's teachings about right and wrong, about the value of every human life, regardless of race or tribe or nationality. Thomas stood slowly, his decision made even as his heart broke with the weight of it. He walked back to Belle and opened his saddlebags with trembling hands. The medicine bottles seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight as he lifted them out, each one representing hope and life and the possibility of tomorrow. The older warrior watched in confusion as Thomas returned with the bottles. "What is this?" he asked. "Medicine," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse with emotion and illness. "For the coughing sickness. It will help your son." The cowboy knelt again beside the injured young man and carefully measured out the proper dosage, just as the doctor in Kansas City had instructed. His hand shook slightly as he administered the medicine, knowing that with each drop, he was giving away his brother's chance at survival. The Kiowa warriors watched in stunned silence as Thomas explained how to continue the treatment, how often to give the medicine, and what signs to watch for. He gave them every bottle, holding nothing back, teaching the older warrior how to measure the doses and care for his son. When he was finished, Thomas stood and faced a group of men who were staring at him with expressions of disbelief and growing understanding of what he had just done. The older warrior stepped forward, his eyes filled with something that Thomas had rarely seen directed toward him from any man, red or white, complete and utter respect. "Why?" the older man asked simply. "You are sick too. This medicine, it could save you." Thomas looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, and cast the sky in shades of orange and purple. In that direction lay Cedar Ridge, where Samuel waited for medicine that would never come. Behind him lay his own past, his own choices, his own understanding of what it meant to be a man of honor. "My brother is sick too," Thomas said quietly. "This medicine was for him. But your son is young. He has many years ahead of him, many seasons to see. My brother and I, we have lived our lives. If I can save one young life, maybe that's enough." The older warrior was quiet for a long time, studying Thomas's face in the fading light. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "You have given us the greatest gift. My son will live because of your sacrifice. This will not be forgotten." Thomas nodded and turned back toward Belle. As he mounted his horse, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. He had made his choice, and whatever came next, He could face it knowing that he had acted with honor. As he rode away from the group of Kiowa warriors, Thomas heard the older man calling after him in their native language. Though he didn't understand all the words, he caught enough to know that they were words of blessing, of gratitude, of promises that would extend far beyond this single moment. The cowboy rode through the night, pushing Bell as hard as he dared, hoping against hope that he might still reach Samuel in time to at least say goodbye. The medicine was gone, but perhaps he could still comfort his brother in his final hours, still keep the promise to return, even if he returned empty-handed. As dawn broke over the prairie, Thomas McCarthy continued his journey towards Cedar Ridge, carrying with him the weight of an impossible choice and the hope that somehow, some way, his sacrifice would mean something more than just the loss of his brother's last chance at life. 3 days had passed since Thomas McCarthy had given away his brother's medicine to save the life of a young Kiowa warrior. The cowboy rode into Cedar Ridge just as the morning sun painted the small frontier town in shades of gold and amber. His body ached from the relentless journey, and the tuberculosis in his lungs made every breath a struggle. But he had finally made it home. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that existed on hope and determination, carved out of the wilderness by people who believed they could make something from nothing. Wooden buildings lined the single main street, their fresh lumber still bright against the endless sky. The general store, the saloon, the church, and a handful of houses represented the dreams of families who had come west seeking a better life. Thomas dismounted in front of the small house where Samuel and Sarah lived, his legs unsteady after days in the saddle. Belle stood with her head hanging low, as exhausted as her rider. The cowboy took a moment to gather his courage before walking up the worn wooden steps to the front door. Through the window, he could see the soft glow of an oil lamp burning in the bedroom where he knew his brother lay. Sarah opened the door before Thomas could knock. Samuel's wife was a small woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, aged beyond her 28 years by worry and sleepless nights. When she saw Thomas standing on her doorstep, her face lit up with desperate hope. "Thomas, thank God you're back. Do you have it? Do you have medicine?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile hope she had been holding onto for days. Thomas looked into Sarah's eyes, seeing the trust and expectation there, and felt his heart break all over again. He had rehearsed this moment during the long ride to town, trying to find words that could somehow explain what he had done, but now that he stood before his sister-in-law, all his carefully planned speeches seemed inadequate. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, "I need to see Samuel first. We need to talk." The hope in Sarah's eyes dimmed slightly, replaced by a growing concern. "Thomas, what's wrong? Where's the medicine?" "The doctor said if Samuel didn't start the treatment soon." "I know what the doctor said," Thomas interrupted gently. "Please, just let me see my brother." Sarah stepped aside, her movements mechanical as fear began to replace hope. Thomas walked through the small parlor, noting the neat but sparse furnishings, the quilts that Sarah had made hanging on the walls, the Bible open on the table beside Samuel's favorite chair. Everything spoke of a life built with love and care, a home that two people had created together against all odds. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the oil lamp on the bedside table. Samuel lay propped up on pillows, his face gaunt and pale, his breathing labored but steady. The tuberculosis was winning its battle, just as it was winning its battle against Thomas himself. "I made it back," Thomas confirmed, squeezing Samuel's hand gently. "How are you feeling, little brother?" Samuel managed a weak laugh. "Like I've been better. But I knew you'd come back with the medicine. You always keep your promises, Tom. Always." The trust in Samuel's voice made Thomas's chest tighten with grief. His younger brother had always looked up to him, had always believed that Thomas could fix anything, solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. From the time they were children, Samuel had turned to Thomas when things went wrong, confident that his big brother would make everything right. "Samuel," Thomas began carefully, "I need to tell you about what happened on my way back here." Sarah had followed them into the bedroom and now stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Thomas could feel her watching him, waiting for him to produce the medicine that would save her husband's life. Thomas told him everything. He described the scene he had encountered in the valley, the injured young Kiowa warrior who was dying from the same disease that was killing Samuel. He explained about the father's desperate plea, about the impossible choice he had faced, about the decision he had made to give away the medicine. As Thomas spoke, He watched the emotions play across Samuel's face. Surprise gave way to understanding, understanding to something that looked like pride. Samuel's grip on Thomas's hand never wavered, even as his brother explained that there would be no medicine, no miraculous cure, no last-minute salvation. Sarah's reaction was different. When Thomas finished his story, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Then, she turned and walked out of the room without saying a word. Thomas could hear her footsteps in the parlor, then the soft sound of crying that she was trying to muffle. "You gave it all away," Samuel said quietly. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Every bottle." The boy was dying, Samuel. He was just a kid, maybe 20 years old. I couldn't let him die when I had the medicine that could save him. Samuel was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Thomas waited, knowing that his brother needed time to process what he had been told. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, announcing the full arrival of morning. "You did the right thing," Samuel finally said, his voice stronger than it had been since Thomas entered the room. "I'm proud of you, Tom. You did exactly what I would have wanted you to do." Thomas felt tears threaten to overwhelm him. "Samuel, I'm so sorry. I promised you I'd bring back the medicine. I promised I'd save you." Samuel turned his head to look directly at his brother. "And you did save me, Tom. Maybe not my body, but you saved something more important. You saved my belief that my brother is the most honorable man I've ever known. You gave away your only chance at life to save a stranger, someone that most people in this town would consider an enemy. If I have to die, I can't think of a better reason." The brothers sat together in silence as the morning light grew stronger outside the window. Thomas thought about all the years they had spent together, all the adventures and hardships they had shared. Samuel had always been the gentle one, the one who saw the best in people, who believed that good would triumph over evil if given the chance. Now, facing his own death, Samuel was proving that his faith in goodness hadn't been misplaced. Sarah returned to the room an hour later, her eyes red from crying, but her composure restored. She brought coffee for Thomas and water for Samuel, moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been caring for a sick husband for weeks. When she finished her tasks, she sat on the edge of the bed and took Samuel's other hand. "I'm sorry," she said to Thomas. "I was angry for a moment, but I shouldn't have been. You did what any good man would do, what Samuel would have done if he had been in your place." Thomas nodded, grateful for her forgiveness, but still struggling with his own guilt. "I wish there had been another way. I wish there had been enough medicine for both of them." "There wasn't," Sarah said simply. "You had to choose, and you chose to save a life instead of letting someone die. That's what good people do." Over the next few days, word of what Thomas had done began to spread through Cedar Ridge. Some people were supportive, understanding the moral complexity of the choice he had faced. Others were critical, arguing that Thomas should have prioritized his own family over strangers, especially natives whom many townspeople viewed with suspicion or hostility. Dr. Williams, the town's only physician, visited Samuel every day, doing what he could to ease his suffering, even though they all knew the outcome was inevitable. The doctor had experience treating tuberculosis and confirmed what Thomas already knew. Without the medicine, Samuel had perhaps a week or two left to live. "I've seen this disease take many good people," Dr. Williams told Thomas privately. "Samuel is handling it better than most. He's at peace with what's coming, and that's not always the case. Whatever you said to him about the medicine, it helped him accept his fate with dignity." Thomas spent every moment he could at Samuel's bedside, talking about their childhood, their adventures on the cattle drives, their dreams, and hopes for the future. Sarah joined them often, sharing memories of her courtship with Samuel, their wedding day, the plans they had made for the children they would never have. Samuel's condition declined steadily, but peacefully. He remained lucid and alert, more concerned about comforting Thomas and Sarah than about his own suffering. On the fourth day after Thomas's return, Samuel called his brother close and spoke in a voice that was growing weaker by the hour. "Tom, I need you to promise me something. Anything," Thomas replied without hesitation. "When this is over, I want you to go back to that Kiowa camp. I want you to check on that young man you saved. I want you to see that the medicine worked, that your sacrifice meant something." Thomas was surprised by the request. "Samuel, I don't even know if they're still in the area. They might have moved on by now. Promise me you'll try," Samuel insisted. I need to know that some good came out of all this. I need to know that my death saved someone else's life. Thomas promised, though he wasn't sure how he would fulfill such a commitment. His own health was deteriorating rapidly, and he doubted he would live much longer than Samuel. But if his brother wanted him to make the attempt, he would do everything in his power to honor that wish. Samuel died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising over Cedar Ridge. He passed peacefully in his sleep, with Sarah holding one hand and Thomas holding the other. His last words had been spoken the night before, a simple thank you to both of them for loving him and caring for him until the end. The funeral was held 2 days later at the small church on Main Street. Most of the town attended, despite the controversy surrounding Thomas's decision about the medicine. Samuel had been well-liked in Cedar Ridge, known for his kindness and generosity, his willingness to help anyone who needed assistance. The preacher spoke about sacrifice and love, about the choices that define a person's character, about the hope of salvation that awaited all good souls. Thomas stood beside Sarah at the graveside, watching as the wooden coffin was lowered into the ground. He thought about Samuel's request, about the promise he had made to check on a young Kiowa warrior. The tuberculosis in his own lungs was getting worse, and Thomas knew he didn't have much time left. But he had promised his brother, and Thomas McCarthy had never broken a promise in his life. After the funeral, as the mourners dispersed and returned to their daily lives, Thomas remained at the grave with Sarah. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the cemetery. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked quietly. Thomas thought about her question. He could stay in Cedar Ridge, live out his remaining weeks or months in comfort, surrounded by people who cared about him. Or he could honor Samuel's final request, undertake one last journey to find the Kiowa tribe, and learn whether his sacrifice had accomplished anything meaningful. "I made Samuel a promise," Thomas said finally. "I need to keep it." Sarah nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow," Thomas replied. "I don't have time to wait." That evening, Thomas prepared for his final journey. He checked his gear, ensured that Belle was properly fed and rested, and wrote a letter to his cousin in Kansas, explaining what had happened and asking him to look after Sarah if she needed help. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, Thomas McCarthy prepared to keep the last promise he would ever make to his brother. Thomas McCarthy rode out of Cedar Ridge at dawn, the morning mist clinging to the prairie grass like ghostly fingers reaching up from the earth. The town was still sleeping, and only Sarah stood on her front porch to watch him leave. She had risen early to pack food for his journey, and to say a goodbye that they both knew might be final. The cowboy's health had deteriorated noticeably since Samuel's death. The tuberculosis was advancing rapidly now, his coughing fits more frequent and violent, often bringing up blood that he tried to hide from others. His body was consuming itself, burning through what little strength remained as it fought a losing battle against the disease. But Thomas had made a promise to his dying brother, and nothing short of death itself would prevent him from keeping it. Belle seemed to sense the importance of this journey, moving with a steadiness that belied her own exhaustion. The mare had been Thomas's companion for over 7 years, carrying him across countless miles of frontier wilderness. She knew her rider's moods, his habits, his needs, and she responded to his gentle guidance with the trust that comes only from years of partnership. The landscape that Thomas rode through was vast and beautiful, rolling hills covered in autumn grass that swayed in the constant wind. Scattered groves of cottonwood and oak provided occasional shade, their leaves turning brilliant shades of yellow and red as the season progressed. In the distance, massive cloud formations moved across the sky like ships sailing on an invisible ocean, casting ever-changing patterns of light and shadow across the land. Thomas had only a general idea of where to look for the Kiowa tribe. He knew they moved frequently, following game herds and seasonal patterns that had guided their people for generations. The valley where he had encountered them was his starting point, but he understood that they might have traveled many miles from that location in the week since he had seen them. As he rode, Thomas found himself thinking about the young warrior whose life he had saved. He wondered if the medicine had worked, if the boy had recovered from both his injury and the tuberculosis that was killing him. Thomas hoped that, unlike his own situation and Samuel's, the treatment had been started early enough to make a difference. The first day of his search yielded no results. Thomas rode in ever-widening circles around the valley where he had first met the Kiowa warriors, looking for signs of their passage, abandoned campsites, horse tracks, or any other indication of their presence. The prairie was vast and seemingly empty, offering few clues about where they might have gone. On the second day, Thomas's luck changed. He found the remains of a recent camp beside a small stream, the ashes of cooked fires still visible among the grass. Horse tracks led away from the site toward the southwest, and Thomas followed them, hoping they would lead him to the people he was seeking. The tracks were several days old, but they were clear enough for an experienced tracker like Thomas to follow. The Kiowa had been traveling with their entire band, including women, children, and elderly members, so their progress would have been slower than a war party or hunting group. Thomas pushed Bell harder than he probably should have, driven by the knowledge that his own time was running out and the fear that he might die before completing his mission. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Thomas spotted smoke rising from a distant ridge. His heart leaped with hope as he urged Bell toward the source. As he crested the hill, he saw them. A large Kiowa encampment spread out in the valley below, their teepees arranged in a traditional circle around a central area where cooked fires burned and people went about their daily activities. Thomas paused on a ridge, studying the camp and trying to determine the best way to approach. He knew that riding directly into a Kiowa village unannounced could be dangerous, especially for a lone white man. But he also knew that the Kiowa people he had met before had shown him respect and gratitude. He hoped that reputation would precede him and ensure a peaceful reception. Taking a deep breath and steeling himself for whatever might come, Thomas rode slowly down the hill toward the camp. His appearance was even more shocking now than it had been a week earlier. His face gaunt and pale, his clothes hanging loose on his diminished frame, his eyes bright with fever but determined with purpose. The first person to notice his approach was a young boy tending horses on the outskirts of the camp. The child stared at Thomas for a moment, then ran toward the teepees, calling out in the Kiowa language. Within moments, warriors were emerging from their dwellings, some carrying weapons, all of them watching the approaching stranger with caution and curiosity. Thomas raised his hands in a gesture of peace, just as he had done the week before. He called out the few Kiowa words he knew, announcing himself as a friend and asking for safe passage. The warriors formed a loose circle around him as he dismounted, their expressions unreadable but not immediately hostile. Then, Thomas heard a familiar voice calling his name. The older warrior who had spoken for the group during their first encounter pushed through the crowd, his face showing recognition and something that looked like surprise. The man's expression quickly changed to concern as he took in Thomas's obviously deteriorated condition. "White medicine man," the older warrior said in his broken English. "You have returned. Why do you come back to us?" Thomas struggled to catch his breath, the exertion of riding and the emotion of the moment combining to trigger a coughing fit that left him doubled over and spitting blood into the grass. When he was finally able to speak, his voice was weak but determined. "I came to see your son," Thomas managed to say, "to see if the medicine worked. My brother died, and before he died, he asked me to come here, to see if his death saved your son's life." The older warrior's eyes filled with understanding and something deeper, a recognition of the profound sacrifice that Thomas had made and the loyalty that had brought him back to this place. He placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder and spoke in a voice heavy with emotion. "Come," he said. "Come see what your gift has done." Thomas was led through the camp, past curious children and women who watched him with expressions ranging from wariness to wonder. He could hear whispered conversations in the Kiowa language, and though he couldn't understand the words, he sensed that his story was being told and retold as they walked. They stopped outside a teepee that was larger than most of the others, decorated with painted symbols and feathers that indicated the high status of its occupants. The older warrior spoke briefly to someone inside, then lifted the entrance flap and gestured for Thomas to enter. The interior of the teepee was warm and dimly lit, furnished with buffalo robes and beautifully crafted items that spoke of a family's wealth and position within the tribe. But Thomas's attention was immediately drawn to a young man who was sitting cross-legged near the center of the space, very much alive and looking remarkably healthy. It was the same warrior Thomas had found dying in the valley a week earlier, but the transformation was dramatic. The young man's breathing was clear and strong, his color good, his eyes bright with intelligence and vitality. He looked up as Thomas entered, and his face broke into a wide smile of recognition and gratitude. The young warrior stood and approached Thomas, speaking rapidly in Kiowa before switching to English that was more fluent than his father's. "You are the white man who gave us the medicine, the one who saved my life." Thomas felt his knees grow weak, and he had to steady himself against the teepee's center pole. The relief and joy that flooded through him were almost overwhelming. The medicine had worked. Samuel's death had not been in vain. The sacrifice had accomplished exactly what Thomas had hoped it would. "You're alive," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're well." "More than well," the young man replied. "The medicine you gave us, it stopped the coughing sickness. Not just for me, but for others in our tribe who were beginning to show the same symptoms. Your gift saved many lives, not just mine." Thomas felt tears running down his cheeks as he absorbed this information. The medicine that could have saved Samuel had indeed saved lives, multiple lives. While his brother's death was still a tragedy, at least now Thomas knew that something meaningful had come from their sacrifice. The older warrior entered the teepee behind Thomas, followed by several other members of what appeared to be the tribal leadership. They arranged themselves in a circle, and Thomas was invited to sit among them. Despite his illness and exhaustion, Thomas could sense that something important was about to happen. The older warrior, who Thomas learned was called Gray Eagle and was one of the tribe's most respected elders, began to speak in both Kiowa and English, ensuring that Thomas could understand everything that was being said. "White Medicine Man," Gray Eagle began, "you came to us as a stranger, but you acted as family. You gave us the medicine that saved our children, even though it meant your own family would suffer. This is a debt that cannot be repaid, but it will never be forgotten." The young warrior, whose name was Standing Bear, stood and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "My father speaks truly. Because of your sacrifice, I will live to see many more seasons. I will marry, have children, grow old among my people. All of this is possible because you chose to save my life instead of your brother's." Thomas tried to protest, to explain that he had only done what any decent person would do, but Gray Eagle raised his hand for silence. "There is more you must know about what your gift has done for our people." Standing Bear sat back down and began to tell Thomas about what had happened since their first meeting. The medicine had not only saved his life, but had also provided hope for the entire tribe. The tuberculosis had been spreading among the Kiowa for several years, taking lives and causing despair among people who had no defense against the disease. When Standing Bear began to recover, the tribal healers had carefully observed the treatment, learning how to recognize the early symptoms of tuberculosis and how to use the remaining medicine to help others. They had managed to save 3 more people who were in the early stages of the disease, and their success had restored confidence in the tribe's ability to protect its members. "But there is something else," Gray Eagle continued. "Something that happened because of your kindness that you could not have known about." The elder explained that Thomas's act of generosity had sparked intense debate among the Kiowa leadership about their relationship with white settlers. For years, there had been growing tensions between the tribe and the expanding white population, with many warriors advocating for aggressive resistance to the encroachment on their lands. "When you gave us the medicine," Gray Eagle said, "you showed us that not all white men are enemies. Some are capable of great kindness, of seeing past the color of skin to the human heart beneath. This has changed how our people think about the future." Standing Bear nodded and took up the story. "Because of what you did, the Council of Elders has decided to seek peace with the white settlers. We will try to find a way to live together on this land, to share it rather than fight over it. Your sacrifice may prevent a war that would have cost many lives on both sides." Thomas listened to this revelation in stunned silence. He had simply tried to save a young man's life, but his action had apparently set in motion events that could affect the fate of entire communities. The idea that Samuel's death might ultimately lead to peace between 2 peoples was both overwhelming and comforting. As the day progressed, Thomas was invited to participate in a special ceremony that the tribe had prepared in his honor. Despite his deteriorating health, he felt obligated to participate, understanding that this was their way of expressing gratitude and respect for what he had done. The ceremony took place at sunset, with the entire tribe gathered in a circle around a large fire. Gray Eagle spoke at length in the Kiowa language, telling Thomas's story and explaining the significance of his sacrifice. Then, Standing Bear stepped forward and presented Thomas with a beautifully crafted medicine bag, decorated with beadwork and containing herbs that the tribal healers believed would help ease his suffering. "This is not payment for what you gave us," Standing Bear explained. "Nothing could repay such a gift. This is a symbol of the bond that now exists between us, a promise that your story will be told among our people for generations to come." Gray Eagle also spoke directly to Thomas, his words translated by his son. "He says that you have shown us the true meaning of brotherhood," Standing Bear interpreted. "He says that when a man is willing to sacrifice his own family's needs to help strangers, he demonstrates that all people are truly one family under the sky." As the ceremony concluded and the tribe began to disperse, Thomas found himself alone with Gray Eagle and Standing Bear beside the dying fire. The old man studied Thomas's face in the flickering light, clearly seeing the advanced state of his illness. "You are very sick," Gray Eagle observed. "The same sickness that my son had." Thomas nodded, no longer trying to hide his condition. "I don't have much time left. Maybe a few weeks, maybe less." "Then, why did you come here?" Standing Bear asked. "Why did you use your remaining strength to find us, instead of spending your last days in comfort among your own people?" Thomas thought about the question for a moment, trying to put into words feelings that he didn't fully understand himself. "I needed to know," he said finally. "I needed to know that my brother's death meant something, that the choice I made saved more than just one life." Gray Eagle nodded slowly, understanding. "And now you know?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "Now I know, and I can die in peace." But Gray Eagle shook his head. "You will not die yet, White Medicine Man. Our healers have medicines too, different from yours, but powerful in their own way. They will help you live long enough to see the good that your sacrifice continues to do in this world." Standing Bear agreed. "You saved my life. Now we will do everything we can to extend yours. It is not payment for a debt. It is what family does for family." As Thomas prepared to rest for the night in a teepee that the tribe had prepared for him, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Samuel's death. He had kept his promise to his brother, and he had learned that their sacrifice had accomplished far more than they could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight, Thomas McCarthy could rest knowing that some good had come from all the pain and loss. Thomas McCarthy awoke the next morning to find himself surrounded by a group of Kiowa healers, elderly men, and women whose faces bore the wisdom of decades spent tending to the sick and injured. The traditional medicine men had arrived at Gray Eagle's request, bringing with them an array of herbs, roots, and treatments that had been passed down through generations of tribal knowledge. The head healer, an ancient woman with silver hair braided with feathers and beads, examined Thomas with gentle but thorough hands. She listened to his chest, studied his skin tone, and asked detailed questions about his symptoms through Standing Bear, who served as translator. Her diagnosis confirmed what Thomas already knew. The tuberculosis was far advanced, and his time was limited. But her prescription was something entirely different from anything he had ever experienced. "She says your body is fighting a war it cannot win," Standing Bear translated as the old woman spoke. "But she believes your spirit is strong, stronger than your sickness. She wants to treat both your body and your spirit to give you time to see the full results of your sacrifice." The treatment began immediately and was unlike anything Thomas had encountered in his 43 years. The healers prepared teas from roots and bark that they said would strengthen his lungs and ease his breathing. They made poultices from prairie plants that were applied to his chest to draw out the infection. Most importantly, they performed ceremonies designed to restore the balance between his physical and spiritual selves. For the first time in months, Thomas felt his symptoms begin to ease. The constant pain in his chest diminished, his breathing became less labored, and the fever that had plagued him for weeks finally broke. The healers warned him that their treatments could only slow the disease, not cure it, but they believed they could give him additional weeks or even months of life. "Why are you doing this for me?" Thomas asked Gray Eagle as they sat together outside the healing teepee. "I'm just one man, and I'm not even one of your people." Gray Eagle smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "You became one of our people the moment you chose to save my son's life instead of your brother's. That kind of sacrifice creates bonds that go deeper than blood or tribe. Besides, we have learned that your story is still being written and we want to see how it ends. What Gray Eagle meant by this became clear over the next several days. Word of Thomas's sacrifice had begun to spread beyond the Kiowa tribe, carried by traders, scouts, and other tribal groups who moved throughout the region. The story of the dying cowboy who gave his medicine to save a Native American youth was becoming something of a legend, inspiring discussions about the possibility of peaceful coexistence between white settlers and tribal peoples. Standing Bear had become something of an ambassador for his people, traveling to nearby settlements and trading posts to share the story and explore opportunities for peaceful dialogue. His presence, as a living example of white generosity toward Native Americans, was helping to change attitudes on both sides of the cultural divide. 3 days ago, I met with the leaders of Millfield. Standing Bear reported to his father and Thomas. They have agreed to establish a trading post where our people can exchange goods fairly, without the cheating that has happened before. They said your story convinced them that we could be trusted partners instead of enemies. Thomas listened to these reports with a mixture of amazement and humility. He had never intended for his action to have such far-reaching consequences. He had simply made what seemed like the right choice in an impossible situation, but that choice was continuing to create positive changes in ways he never could have imagined. The healing treatments allowed Thomas to regain enough strength to participate more fully in the life of the Kiowa camp. He learned about their customs, their history, their deep connection to the land they called home. In return, he shared stories about his own life, his years as a cowboy, his relationship with Samuel, and his understanding of the white settlers who were moving into Kiowa territory. These conversations revealed that Thomas possessed something valuable beyond his willingness to sacrifice. He had a rare ability to see both sides of the conflict between his people and the Kiowa. He understood the settlers' desire for land and opportunity, but he also recognized the Kiowa's legitimate claim to their ancestral territory and their right to maintain their way of life. "You could help us," Gray Eagle suggested one evening as they watched the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "You understand both worlds. You could speak for us to your people, help them see that we are not the savage enemies they believe us to be." Thomas was hesitant to take on such a role. "I'm just a cowboy, Gray Eagle. I don't have any special authority or influence. People might listen to me, but they might just as easily ignore me." "But you have something more powerful than authority," Standing Bear interjected. "You have a story that proves good exists in both our peoples. When people hear what you did, when they see that it led to my recovery and our desire for peace, they will understand that cooperation is possible." The more Thomas thought about this suggestion, the more sense it made. He had extended his life not to simply wait for death, but to use whatever time remained to build on the foundation that his sacrifice had created. If his story could prevent conflict and save lives on both sides, then Samuel's death would have accomplished something truly meaningful. Thomas spent the next 2 weeks traveling with Standing Bear to various settlements and trading posts throughout the region. Despite his ongoing illness and the skepticism they sometimes encountered, Thomas found that people were genuinely interested in hearing his story and learning about his experiences with the Kiowa tribe. At Fort Larson, a military outpost that had been preparing for potential conflict with local tribes, Thomas spoke with the commanding officer about alternatives to military action. The colonel had been planning to send patrols into Kiowa territory to establish a more aggressive presence, but Thomas's account of the tribe's peaceful intentions caused him to reconsider. "You're telling me that these people actually want to avoid a fight?" the colonel asked skeptically. "In my experience, Indians only understand force." Thomas looked the officer directly in the eye. "Colonel, I was dying, and they saved my life. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. They could have let me die and kept the knowledge I brought them about the medicine, but instead they shared their own healing treatments with me. Does that sound like the behavior of savage enemies to you?" The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's gaunt but determined face. "What are you suggesting, McCarthy?" "I'm suggesting you send an envoy to meet with Gray Eagle instead of sending soldiers to intimidate his people. I'm suggesting you to try talking before you start shooting. You might be surprised by what you learn." Similar conversations took place in a dozen small towns and settlements throughout the region. Thomas found that his reputation as a cowboy and his obvious illness gave him a credibility that might have been denied to a healthier advocate. People listened to him not because he was eloquent or powerful, but because he was clearly a dying man who had nothing to gain by lying to them. The response was not universally positive. Some settlers remained convinced that the only solution to the Indian problem was complete removal or elimination of the tribal peoples. But enough minds were changed to create a momentum toward dialogue rather than conflict, and several communities established formal channels for communication with the Kiowa leadership. Perhaps the most significant meeting took place in Cedar Ridge, Thomas's own hometown. He had been reluctant to return there, knowing that his appearance would shock people who had known him before his illness became so advanced. But Standing Bear convinced him that his own community needed to hear his story most of all. Sarah was waiting on her porch when Thomas rode into town, having been warned of his arrival by a neighbor who had spotted him on the trail. The widow had lost weight since Thomas had left, and her eyes showed the strain of recent grief, but she smiled broadly when she saw that her brother-in-law was still alive. "Thomas," she called out, running to meet him. "We heard you were dead. Someone said they saw you riding north, and that you were too sick to survive the journey." Thomas dismounted carefully, still weak despite the improvements in his condition. "Almost didn't survive it," he admitted. "But I found the people I was looking for, and they helped me in ways I never expected." Sarah's eyes widened as she noticed Standing Bear, who had been hanging back respectfully during the reunion. The sight of a Kiowa warrior in Cedar Ridge was unprecedented, and Thomas could see neighbors beginning to gather as word of the unusual visitor spread through the town. Thomas made the introductions carefully, explaining Standing Bear's role in the events that had followed his decision to give away Samuel's medicine. As he told the story, more people gathered, until a substantial crowd had formed in front of Sarah's house. Thomas found himself giving an impromptu speech to virtually the entire population of Cedar Ridge. The reaction was mixed, but generally positive. Dr. Williams was fascinated by Thomas's account of the tribal healing methods and asked detailed questions about the treatments that had extended his life. Several other residents expressed interest in the possibility of peaceful trade relationships with local tribes, seeing economic opportunities in such arrangements. But the most important response came from Reverend Patterson, the minister who had presided over Samuel's funeral. The elderly preacher listened to Thomas's story with growing emotion, and when it was finished, he stepped forward to address the crowd. "Friends," the Reverend said, his voice carrying the authority of his calling, "we have just heard a remarkable testimony about sacrifice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Thomas McCarthy chose to value all human life equally, regardless of race or tribe. And because of that choice, God has used him to open a pathway toward peace in our troubled times." The minister's endorsement carried significant weight in the religious community of Cedar Ridge, and it helped to frame Thomas's story in terms that resonated with Christian settlers who might otherwise have been skeptical of cooperation with Native peoples. That evening, as Thomas and Standing Bear sat with Sarah in her small parlor, they discussed the impact of their journey and the changes it had set in motion. Thomas was exhausted by the day's activities, but he was also deeply satisfied by the response they had received. "Samuel would be proud," Sarah said quietly. "He always believed that people were basically good, that they just needed someone to show them the right path. You've done that, Thomas. You've shown people that there's an alternative to hatred and violence." Standing Bear nodded in agreement. "My father says that your story has given our people hope for the first time in years. Before you came to us, many of our young warriors wanted to fight the white settlers. Now they see that there might be another way." Thomas looked out the window at the darkening sky, thinking about all that had happened since he had made that fateful decision in the valley where he first encountered the Kiowa warriors. Samuel's death still grieved him, but now he could see that his brother's sacrifice had indeed accomplished something beautiful and lasting. "I think I understand now why your healers were able to extend my life," Thomas said thoughtfully. "It wasn't just their medicine. It was because there was still work for me to do, still a purpose for me to serve. Samuel died so that Standing Bear could live, but Standing Bear's life was meant to be more than just one person surviving. It was meant to be a bridge between our peoples." Standing Bear smiled at this interpretation. "In our culture, we believe that all lives are connected, that the actions of one person ripple outward to affect many others. Your sacrifice created those ripples, and they're still spreading." As the three of them sat together in the lamplight, Thomas felt a deep sense of completion. He had kept his promise to Samuel, had seen the good that came from their sacrifice, and had used his extended life to build something meaningful from tragedy. Whatever time remained to him, He would use it to continue this work, to nurture the fragile peace that had grown from the seeds of generosity and hope. 6 months had passed since Thomas McCarthy first gave his brother's medicine to a dying Kiowa warrior. The autumn had given way to a harsh winter, then to a promising spring that painted the prairie in wildflowers and new grass. Thomas had lived far longer than anyone, including himself, had expected, sustained by the tribal medicines and by a sense of purpose that seemed to strengthen him even as his body continued its slow decline. The small cabin that the people of Cedar Ridge had built for Thomas sat on a hill overlooking the town, positioned so that he could see both the settlement below and the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward Kiowa territory. Standing Bear had stayed through the winter, becoming an unofficial ambassador between his people and the growing number of white communities that were interested in establishing peaceful relationships. The cabin had become an unexpected meeting place, a neutral ground where representatives from both cultures could come together to discuss trade, resolve disputes, and work toward the kind of coexistence that had once seemed impossible. Thomas served as a translator not just of languages, but of customs, fears, and hopes that each side struggled to understand about the other. On a warm morning in late April, Thomas sat on his porch watching a group of Kiowa children play, with several white children from Cedar Ridge. The sight still amazed him. Youngsters who had been taught to fear and distrust each other now laughing together as they chased butterflies through the tall grass. It was a small miracle, but one that represented the larger changes that had taken root throughout the region. Sarah approached the cabin carrying a basket of food, her weekly visit to ensure that Thomas was eating properly and to hear the latest news from his various meetings and negotiations. The young widow had found purpose in supporting the peace efforts, using her position in the community to encourage other women to see the Kiowa as potential neighbors rather than threats. "Williams wants to meet with you this afternoon," Sarah said as she unpacked fresh bread and preserves. "He's been corresponding with a doctor in Kansas City about the tribal healing methods you described. They want to study the plants and treatments that helped extend your life." Thomas nodded, though the irony wasn't lost on him. The white medical establishment, which had been unable to save Samuel despite all their expensive medicines, was now eager to learn from the same tribal healers they had once dismissed as primitive and superstitious. "Any word from Fort Larson?" Thomas asked, referring to the military post where negotiations had been taking place for weeks about the establishment of formal peace treaties. "Colonel Henderson sent a message yesterday," Sarah replied. "He wants you to attend the signing ceremony next week. He says your presence would mean something to both sides." Thomas smiled at the thought. A dying cowboy being invited to witness the signing of a peace treaty was not something he could have imagined 6 months earlier. But his story had become a symbol of the possibility for understanding between peoples who had seemed destined for conflict. Standing Bear emerged from the cabin, where he had been writing letters to other tribal leaders throughout the region, sharing the success they had achieved and encouraging similar efforts elsewhere. The young warrior had become an articulate advocate for peace, his survival serving as living proof that cooperation between white and Native American communities could benefit everyone involved. "My father sends word that the Great Council will meet next month," Standing Bear reported. "Representatives from 6 tribes want to hear our story and discuss following our example with their own white neighbors." This was the news Thomas had been hoping for. The peace they had negotiated around Cedar Ridge and the surrounding area was spreading, inspiring other tribal groups and settler communities to seek alternatives to the cycle of suspicion and violence that had characterized frontier relationships for decades. But as promising as these developments were, Thomas could feel his body beginning to fail despite all the treatments and care he had received. The tribal medicines had given him precious months of life, but they could not cure the tuberculosis that continued to consume him from within. He had maybe weeks left, possibly less, and he was determined to use that time to ensure that the peace they had built would survive his death. "I want to write it all down," Thomas told his companions. "The whole story, from the beginning. How it started, what it led to, what lessons we learned along the way. If this peace is going to last, people need to understand how it began and why it matters." Sarah immediately offered to help with the writing, as did Standing Bear, who could provide the Kiowa perspective on events. Over the next several days, the 3 of them worked together to create a comprehensive account of everything that had happened since that fateful day when Thomas chose to save a stranger's life instead of his brother's. The document they produced was more than just a historical record. It was a manual for peacemaking, a detailed explanation of how seemingly insurmountable differences could be bridged through acts of compassion and courage. They described the specific steps they had taken to build trust, the mistakes they had made along the way, and the strategies that had proven most effective in changing minds and hearts. Word of the writing project spread quickly through both communities, and soon Thomas found himself receiving visits from people who wanted to share their own stories and observations. Former skeptics admitted how their opinions had changed. Tribal elders spoke about the hope they now felt for their grandchildren's future. Young people from both cultures described friendships that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. One particularly moving visit came from a group of women from both communities who had begun working together on various projects. They had started by sharing traditional medicines and remedies, but their collaboration had expanded to include childcare, food preservation, and even the creation of artistic works that blended elements from both cultures. "You showed us that our differences don't have to divide us," one of the white women explained. "When we started talking to the Kiowa women about how they raised their children and cared for their families, we realized we wanted the same things for our loved ones. We just had different ways of achieving those goals." A Kiowa woman nodded in agreement. "Before, we saw white women as competitors for resources, as threats to our way of life. Now we see them as allies, as people who can teach us new skills while learning from our traditions. This understanding came from the example you set." These testimonies, along with dozens of others, became part of the written record that Thomas, Sarah, and Standing Bear were compiling. They wanted future generations to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been accomplished and how it could be replicated in other situations where different peoples struggled to coexist. As May progressed, Thomas's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly. The tribal healers continued their treatments, but they warned that his body was beginning to shut down in ways that their medicines could not prevent. Thomas accepted this news with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout his extended battle with tuberculosis. "I've lived longer than I deserved," he told Gray Eagle during one of the elders' frequent visits. "I've seen Samuel's death accomplish more good than either of us could have imagined. I'm ready for whatever comes next." Gray Eagle shook his head firmly. "You have not lived longer than you deserved. You have lived exactly as long as the Great Spirit intended. Your story needed time to unfold completely, to show its full power to change hearts and minds. Now that work is finished, and you can rest knowing it will continue without you." The peace treaty signing ceremony took place on a beautiful morning in mid-May, with representatives from 6 tribal groups and a dozen settler communities gathering at Fort Larson. Thomas was too weak to make the journey, but the ceremony was brought to him in the form of a smaller signing that took place on his porch, with the most important leaders from both sides traveling to Cedar Ridge to include him in the historic moment. Colonel Henderson read aloud the key provisions of the treaty, which established formal boundaries, trade relationships, and mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. But the most significant element was a preamble that told Thomas's story and declared it to be the foundation principle upon which the entire agreement was based. "Let it be recorded," the colonel read, "that this treaty grows from the soil prepared by the sacrifice of Thomas McCarthy and Samuel McCarthy, whose example proved that the welfare of all people is more important than the interests of any single group, and whose courage showed that peace is always possible when good people choose compassion over conflict." Thomas listened to these words with tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. Samuel's name would be remembered not as a victim of disease or sacrifice, but as a co-founder of a new way of living together on the frontier. The promise he had made to his dying brother had been kept in ways he never could have imagined. Standing Bear was asked to speak for his people at the ceremony, and his words captured the transformation that had taken place over the past months. 6 moons ago, many of us believed that war was inevitable, that white settlers and native peoples could not share this land. One man's act of kindness changed all of that. Thomas McCarthy showed us that we are not enemies by nature, but by choice. Today we choose differently. In the days following the treaty signing, delegations began arriving from communities throughout the region and beyond. Word of the Cedar Ridge peace model was spreading across the frontier, inspiring similar efforts in places where conflict had seemed certain. Thomas received letters from as far away as Colorado and the Dakota Territory asking for copies of the written account, and requesting advice on how to replicate their success. "It's bigger than we ever imagined it could be," Sarah marveled as she read through the latest batch of correspondence. "Your story is giving people hope in places we've never even heard of." Thomas nodded weakly from his bed, where he was spending most of his time now as his strength continued to ebb. "Samuel always said that good actions create ripples that spread farther than we can see. I think you would be amazed by how far these particular ripples have traveled." Standing Bear had delayed his return to his own people to be with Thomas during his final days, a decision that the young warrior said was an honor rather than a burden. "You saved my life," he reminded Thomas whenever the dying man expressed guilt about keeping him away from his family. "The least I can do is be here when you need me." On a quiet evening in late May, as the three of them sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors, Thomas spoke about what he hoped would happen after his death. "The peace we've built is still fragile," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It will need constant tending, constant care if it's going to survive and grow. Promise me you'll continue this work, both of you. Promise me you'll make sure Samuel's sacrifice wasn't wasted." Sarah and Standing Bear both promised, understanding that they were accepting not just a responsibility, but a sacred trust. The peace that had grown from tragedy and sacrifice would need new champions, new stories, new examples of courage and compassion to sustain it through the challenges ahead. Thomas McCarthy died 3 days later, on a morning when the prairie was covered in wildflowers and the air was sweet with the promise of summer. He passed peacefully in his sleep, with Sarah holding one hand and Standing Bear holding the other, just as he and Sarah had been with Samuel during his final moments. The funeral that followed was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Members of 6 different tribal groups joined with hundreds of white settlers to honor the memory of a man whose single act of kindness had changed the course of history for countless people. Speakers from both cultures praised Thomas's courage, his wisdom, and his unwavering commitment to the belief that all human lives were equally valuable. But the most powerful tribute came not from words, but from the sight of the diverse crowd itself. People who had once viewed each other as enemies now standing together in shared grief and shared hope. Children who had been taught to fear and distrust those who looked different from them played together while their parents planned for a future that would be built on cooperation rather than conflict. The written account of Thomas's story was published and distributed throughout the frontier regions, becoming a handbook for communities that wanted to build bridges rather than walls. Standing Bear traveled extensively, sharing his experiences and helping other groups navigate the difficult but rewarding process of building trust across cultural divides. Sarah remained in Cedar Ridge, serving as a keeper of Thomas's memory and an advocate for the peace principles he had championed. The small house where she and Samuel had lived became a kind of shrine, visited by people from across the region who wanted to pay their respects to the family whose sacrifice had made so much possible. Years later, when historians wrote about the period of peaceful expansion in the American West, they would mark the day Thomas McCarthy gave his medicine to Standing Bear as the beginning of a new chapter in frontier history. The Treaty of Cedar Ridge became a model for dozens of other agreements, and the peace process that grew from one man's act of compassion prevented countless conflict that might otherwise have cost thousands of lives. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Thomas's story was not recorded in any history book or government document. It lived on in the children of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding communities, both white and Native American, who grew up believing that cooperation was natural, that differences were opportunities rather than threats, and that the welfare of strangers was just as important as the welfare of family. Standing Bear lived to be an old man, becoming one of the most respected peace advocates in the region. He often told Thomas's story to his own children and grandchildren, ensuring that the Cowboy's example would inspire future generations. And whenever young people asked him why he dedicated his life to building bridges between peoples, he would smile and touch the medicine bag that Thomas had been given by the Kiowa healers, which Standing Bear had inherited and treasured as a symbol of the power of sacrifice to transform the world. The story of Thomas McCarthy, Samuel McCarthy, and Standing Bear became a legend that spread far beyond the frontier, inspiring people in other times and places to believe that peace was possible even in the midst of seemingly insurmountable conflict. It proved that a single act of courage and compassion, performed by an ordinary person in an extraordinary moment, could change the course of history and create ripples of hope that would continue spreading for generations to come.